What are some of the mistakes you want people to look out for? Because again, people listening to this podcast are no stranger to VO2 max. We talk about it as if you were going to sort of say, I need to know 10 parameters of my body for optimal health, VO2 max is on that list every day of the week.
Yes.
So even if you are listening to this and you don't care about triathlons or cycling or swimming, but you just have the desire to live as long as you can and as well as you can, you have to know your VO2 max and you need to optimize it and make it, frankly, as high as you can with whatever time you're willing to devote to training. That said, most people aren't going to go out and buy a VO2 Master, and they're not going to, geek out and do this stuff on their own. They're going to rely on going to a place where the VO2 max is measured in a stationary fashion, either on a treadmill or on a bike. What are some things that those folks need to be aware of when they go to a center to test this as far as mistakes that people make? So for example, I've seen many people go and do a test and I talk to them after and I go, how exhausted were you at the end of the test? And they say, it was okay. I could have kept going. And I'm realizing, okay, you didn't do a maximal test. Other mistakes I've seen are people who don't have a long enough warm-up time. The total test took 5 minutes. And I'm like, well, you didn't come close to sufficiently warming up. So are there any other things that you would just have people have in the back of their mind when they call a place up to say, hey, I want to come and do a VO2 max test, but before I give you my $100, I want to understand the protocol?
Yeah, and then of course the question becomes also to what extent you're able to influence this as well, because there are some practices that they want it done in a very rigorous way. They even almost prescribe what you should do the days leading before, and another where you just come in and they just put you through a test and then you get what you get.
So what should folks look for? Where if you were sending somebody to just a public place where they could go and do this, they're not coming into your lab where you're going to administer the test, what would you want them to be looking for?
So what I would normally do is a one I would try to create as a standardized protocol from time to time. And that means not only the testing itself, but also what happens a little bit before, without it becomes too invasive into people's lives, like standardizing what you do the days before and all these kind of things. I think this is impractical for most people. Yeah. Like if this is a very important metric for you, like one of the key metrics you use in order to understand how have the previous period influenced you, and you're looking for marginal changes, then it becomes very important also how you standardize the days before. But I would say for a normal person, I would say that I would keep a standardized protocol for how. So I would come in there, let's say at least trying to eat pretty much the same every time I go there, and that means making sure you are well fueled as if you were going to do an important training session. That means normally more carbohydrates, make sure you're well hydrated, and obviously also that you are, to the extent you can influence it, or you should be able to influence it, but make sure that you also had a proper sleep so you don't come in there like completely tired and things like this. Reasonably well rested. Maybe not train the day before, would you say, or light training the day before? I would say that as long, this is where I would say it's more important to use your experience and to have enough understanding of what makes you set up for a good test the day after. Yeah. So for some people that exercise is irregular and there are more time in between. Obviously, if you're going to do a little bit harder exercise the day before or anything like this, you'll come into the session and you even feel sore in the muscles. This is not ideal necessarily for the ability to mobilize. For other athletes that are well trained, then it's completely different. Then it's more like, okay, what would I do the day before a competition or anything like this? Doesn't have to be an elite level, but more like you think a little bit like, what do I want to do in order to make sure that I've gone through the different stuff and I feel ready for the day after. So on the day of the test itself, I would one is important, timing of the day. This is important to try to keep somewhat consistent, I would say, because of the circadian rhythm. We know that, for example, your temperature levels in your body, this fluctuates. This is maybe one of the easiest observable differences in a human, basically call it as an indirect measure of the circadian rhythm, where we would basically see that you have a minimum point that happens typically in the morning just before you wake up, and then you have a maximum point typically in the afternoon. And there is, of course, plenty of research suggesting that aerobic exercises are best done normally a little bit in the afternoon when you are typical also around the highest core temperature or natural core temperature. The minimum point is easy to measure. So for people that has the core, like now it's become very popular, like in the Tour de France and other places, triathlons, you see these people, they run around with this little temperature device on their body. And it's very easy to observe if you use it 24/7. This is very easy to observe basically when your minimum point is. The maximum point is influenced, can be masked by noise and other things, activities and other things you do. So it's a little bit harder to see where it is. But let's say you put them 12 hours apart as a guiding tool. But now I'm already getting to the point where it gets a little bit, let's say, more detailed. But I would just say, keep the timing of the day the same. So it really doesn't matter if you do it in the afternoon or you do it in the morning, as long as you keep it consistent. Then from there, I would do a proper warm-up. That's important.
How long do you think that should be for an untrained, for a person who's like modestly trained? Let's assume we're not doing this on someone completely untrained, but someone who's, recreationally trained versus relatively elite.
So again, here I would do a warm-up much in the same way I would do a training session. So I would normally stick to a standardized warm-up protocol where you start out maybe, for example, 6 minutes, very easy. This can even be walking. Then I would do, or basically pedaling, soft pedaling. Then I would do 6 minutes with a little bit more effort, but it typically should be more something that you would be comfortable doing as your longest sessions that you do. So if you are out and you do, like I say, the longest sessions you do is an hour. And obviously if they're all out, then it would be a little bit too hard, but then you should more aim for something I could do for this would be an easy session for me, but I could do it for some while. You could, for some people, say this is your marathon, let's say, days, or where you do more of a longer rides. And then I would do a short effort around 3 minutes. That sits somewhere where I wouldn't, at this time, I wouldn't look too much on my power meter or my heart rate or anything, but more by feeling, where you feel, okay, this is where my threshold would be. And then I would probably also do, let's say, a couple of short efforts that are, let's say, progressively towards VO2 max. So let's say 1, 2, 3, maybe 2 to 3 efforts that are somewhere between 10, 15 seconds with equal rest in between. And the reason for this is that it's easy to think, but don't you exhaust yourself now before you do the VO2 max then? Well, no, you don't. There are two, let's say the little fatigue that you possibly would induce with this is easily offset by other factors that will much more contribute to your VO2 max when you start doing this. So that means also that after I've done this one, I would just again go back to easy, very short, easy effort. So you get a total warm-up of 20 minutes, something like this. In between there, take a toilet break or anything like this, but don't keep this rest too long, because obviously now you're going to cool down again if you don't go to your VO2 max test now. So that means also have a small sip of water, something like this, if you want to do that. Also, before you start your warm-up, it can be good things if you have something carbohydrate-based, you consume a little bit of that. Mm-hmm. Some people would say, I don't like this because it could influence depending on how you do this.
It can influence the RQ.
Yeah. But then again, this is something I would say that a sub-maximal, yes, maximal, it won't do that very much, because at the closer you get to your metabolic steady state or maximal metabolic steady state and then above, basically things starts to basically homogenize.
It's so high anyway. Yeah. We tend to do these separately now. So we don't use the day of the VO2 max test to do the fuel partitioning test. So we want to measure fat oxidation on a totally different day. We'll usually separate by a day even, right? So you'll do your VO2 max test on Monday, and we'll do it like this kind of way where we, again, agree completely, like you should have all the carbs in the world. We actually like to standardize the fat oxidation test to a fasting test. Okay. And just that way, it's just always the same. It's like, you're going to do it in the morning, you're fasted. It's a sub-maximal effort. We're not pushing you to maximum because we're just pushing to see what your maximum fat oxidation is.
I think this is a good way to open up, let's say, a little bit the door to how where we are, because again, we are at the edge cases where basically we have to do the research ourselves. But one thing we have to consider is that basically when we do when we do gas exchange measurements, for example, to understand a little bit substrate metabolism. And
what's your preferred in-lab test? Do you use Parvo?
No, we use a device which is I'm still on an old device. There are 2 devices I like to use. One is the Jaeger Oxycon-Pro with a mixing chamber, and this is important.
Yes.
Yeah. The Parvo has a mixing chamber as well, but we have the Oxycon Jaeger Pro. When I've been testing in the US, for example, on elite athletes or Olympic athletes, then we have used the Parvo simply because that's the one that has been here. Europe is more used the Jaeger. We don't use the, well, maybe I shouldn't say that we don't use the VO2 CPX, which is the successor of Jaeger Oxycon-Pro. But this is one of the devices. We use also the AEI MOXUS, but this is more of a, call it for specially interested people. And then we use also the VO2 Master actually quite significantly. And more of the testing actually have gone over to the VO2 Master. We have been fortunate enough to working with them for some while, so we have let's say the CO2 version as well.
Yep.
But this is where it, let's say, it has been in alpha mode, and it requires also completely different skills than what you would normally require. But the reason also why we do that is, again, also for one of the reasons you experience is that you see that your VO2 max is maybe a little bit different when you are out and cycling and do the efforts, and it's not inside the laboratory. Because also we have to remember that VO2 max is on the one side we say it's the highest oxygen consumption over normally, as a normalized over 1 minute.
Yep.
That is a result of how much muscles that are involved in the work there. So obviously modality will influence this quite a bit as well. So that's also why there is...
Which is why I was surprised when you said the guys were lower in swimming than cycling and running, even though I realized that their efficiency in swimming is relative to the world's best less than it is in cycling and running, where they would be closer to the world's elite. But I would have just thought more muscles would have meant higher O2 consumption.
Yeah, so actually let me shed some light on it, because I said, like I started with actually just on that one. That was basically when I started working with Christian and Gustav. Where they are today is that basically there are virtually no difference between swimming, cycling and running. It's
same VO2 max.
More or less on the three disciplines, but it has again to do exactly like you said. You can manipulate your VO2 max by that you are targeting, let's say, typically shorter duration efforts, and so you start recruiting more, learn to recruit a little bit more, and also train, let's say, fibers that you are not normally used to use so much. And this is also something that is highly plastic, much more plastic than we ever have thought it was before, to the point where we have some leading researchers in Norway that they've solely focused on VO2 max, and let's say they went into schools where they've done this for decades, but where we even sat down and we looked at the data and thought something has to be wrong. And that comes actually from the period when we switched from Tokyo Olympics and then on to Ironman, and basically we saw a decline in VO2 max. From me, not unexpected, but more like there hasn't been data on this, so it was actually quite nice to
And what was
measure
the
it.
decline? How much?
So the decline in absolute, or let's say in relative VO2 max, and so it makes more sense for people, is that Christian and Gustav typically, like the highest numbers we have had on them are very, very high. Highest numbers ever measured in history. But
so, 90?
Well, Christian, we've had measurements with him actually and validated, but on him we have exceeded in absolute terms 7.8 liters per minute in oxygen uptake. So
at what, 75 kilos?
No, so then at that time he was around 80 kilograms, so just let's say around 100 milliliter per minute per kilogram in oxygen uptake. Gustav is a little bit smaller, so he has a little bit, let's say, a little bit lower oxygen uptake than what Christian have, but he has at the highest, he clocked in around, let's say, 94 milliliter per minute per kilogram, something like this at the highest. But I would say that this is not beneficial for what they are doing.
Of course, yeah. Again, I realize that I think anybody who's done this type of testing and done this kind of work, it's they'll have an appreciation for what those numbers mean, which is to say, I'm trying to come up with an analogy for another sport to explain what that would be. That would sort of be like, I don't know how to compare it to non-endurance sports, right? Like I don't know. It's like saying, and in an NBA basketball game, occasionally they score 100 points. Like it just doesn't. It's like it doesn't compute. It doesn't really compute that they could utilize that much oxygen.
Yeah. So the interesting thing there, and the good thing about it, is that this was something we reproduced over 3 months
But the training at that time was presumably geared specifically towards VO2 maximization. It was short distance, it was interval based.
Well, actually, yes, it was. But this is also where one of the things that is that one place where we resonate a lot is that we both like VO2 max is the single best metric we probably have for anything that is related to human health and performance. But it is a little bit more nuanced, and it is also where we understand that it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And now I'm not talking about it as pure as a predictor for your race performance, because that's a different domain. But where you could also say that you could still be healthier with a little bit lower VO2 max. And I'm not talking because about that you put yourself through some stress and other things like this, so that it becomes negative longer term. But it's VO2 max is a one-dimensional also unit again. We talk about something on a y-axis. Yes, we normalize it as a milliliter per minute. So you could say that it has a second axis to it, an x-axis or time axis to it as well. But we don't say how long.
Over what duration. We don't get into capacity.
Exactly. And this means also that you can trade off some of your VO2 max. And I would say that the very, very best predictor is capacity. Like capacity is maybe the single best one for everything. But the problem is that testing for capacity is such a brute force endeavor that it's not practical. It is really not practical. That's why VO2 max is the most, like I would say, is the single best predictor of everything measured in a practical way. But for Christian, what was really nice when we did this is it was not only actually where we measured, and I can say that we are at the edge where there are things here we don't understand. There are still things we are researching. And like you said, introductory, I'm in the applied world. And in the applied world means basically much more experimentation and understanding what happens here with some individuals. My sample size doesn't come from the population. It comes from the sheer amount of data that I gather on these athletes. So it's not like a single VO2 max test. It is so many VO2 max tests that there's probably no other human in history where they have been through these testing protocols over time. And where we can correlate it to also a range of other metrics as well, both internally but also external metrics. And that means that, for example, here to put this into context, the good thing is that when we do testing, I normally not only have Christian into the lab, I have also minimum of, let's say, 1 or 2 athletes as well into the lab. And our protocols are quite extensive. So this is also one thing that we already talked about, that protocols can have an influence on testing. And what you do before the protocol will have an influence on your VO2 max. That's exactly why we're discussing, should you warm up or should you not warm up? Yes, you should, because it will normally give you, let's say, a better result. Yeah. When you are warmed up. But that means also that the protocol can also then have an influence on your VO2 max measurements. And we normally do the VO2 max measurements at the end of our test, which is, you would say, but that's normal. Yes, well, we also do that simply because it also more normally simulates what they're also going to see on racing. So normally what happens in racing is that you normally also will go closer to, let's say, complete exhaustion when you get towards the end of the race. And this is why it's interesting to test it there. But we don't only test it like once, we even repeat it. So we do 2 VO2 max tests just 10 minutes apart. And even this year, we did even 3 tests, let's say with less than or 10 minutes apart as well. Interesting thing here is that what we see is that you normally don't get your highest VO2 max on the first one, even though you're exhausted. We even see that even in a second one.